Do you like beams in Tales of Maj'Eyal? Everyone does, right? Well, good news, because there is a Archmage class evolution that is all about beams and firing as many of them as possible. And it's all pretty easy to unlock, so you can play it even if you're a new player. Class evolutions are prodigies that usually pretty drastically change the way a class is played. There are only a few of them in the game, but they are really fun to play with. To unlock this one, you first need to have Archmage unlocked, which you probably already have. All you need to do is give a magic artifact to this guy, and then to unlock the class evolution, you need to kill a level 10 or higher boss with only beams. This is also pretty easy to do on accident, since most of the starting Archmage talents are beams. But if you don't have it, the easiest way to do it is to start a run on the insane difficulty as Archmage, and then the boss in the starting dungeon will be level 11. So you just put some points into a couple of the beams, kill it, and you have the class evolution. So let's have a look at what exactly this Prodigy does. So first, the requirements are 50 magic and 25 willpower. You are taking these stats anyways on Archmage, so that's not really a requirement. And it also forces you to wear cloth armor, which you were going to do anyways. The upsides are that it turns the first talents into 3 white beams. Most of these are already beams, and turning them 3 white is definitely better, but it's honestly not that much better. Beams are already just really good as a base type of spell, but why you take this is for the unique Thaumaturgy class tree, and you get the best spell right at the start with Orb of Thaumaturgy, which duplicates any beams you cast targeted at the orb. So that's 2 beams for every beam that you cast. But then Archmage has access to Mirror Image, which is an incredible tool at helping you survive, because it taunts all enemies around it, and it can only ever lose 1 life, so it doesn't really care about how dangerous an enemy is. And then the second part of this talent is that the mirror image copies your talents, and in this case it's going to copy your beam, and it will also get copied at the Orb of Thaumaturgy, so that's 4 beams for every 1 beam that you cast. There's actually even a way to get 6 beams for every 1 beam that you cast, because if you do mirror image before the Orb of Thaumaturgy, the mirror image will also cast the orb, but it will try to cast it on the same tile as you do, which will not let you duplicate the beam 3 times. But sometimes, either if you aim at a wall or if the mirror image is out of range, you can have it summon the orb on a different tile than you will, and then you get even more beams. I've not figured out a way to do this consistently, but you don't really need this because the orb is just ridiculous. Its instant speed only costs 35 mana, so this by itself is more or less worth the Prodigy. Then the second talent you get is Multicaster, and this is a sustain that gives you an up to 30% chance to cast another spell each time you cast a beam spell. That sounds ridiculously good, but there are 2 big downsides to this talent. The first one is that these spells are limited. Only some of them will work. For example, none of the beams are available, so you can't fire beams from beams. And you can't pick out of the eligible spells. Once you learn an eligible spell, it is possible that it gets used from a multicaster. The second downside is that if you do cast a spell from multicaster, it will still cost mana, which is pretty nasty. If you, for example, went Arcane Archmage, you have something like Ether Breach that costs 50 mana. It's not really a super good spell, but it's usable. But let's say you hit this, and it's possible to multicast 2 times per turn. So if you get unlucky, in 3 turns, this could cost you 300 mana, casting Ether Breach over and over. So you have to be really careful about which spells you put points into. And I think this opens up some really cool build possibilities, because usually on Archmage you just pick an element, right? You want to go Lightning Archmage, so you take all the air talents, and then later on you unlock the Storm category and you take all the Storm talents. It all synergizes together and just makes a lot of sense. But you'll notice I did not take any of the advanced elemental categories, because all of them have this downside of having a couple of these spells that are sort of mediocre to be cast randomly, or sometimes they could even have a downside. If you look at something like Earthquake, maybe you cast it on top of yourself. So I decided to just stick with the basic categories. It's definitely not the only way you can build a high Thaumaturgist, but I think it makes a lot of sense. You see that I ended up with Illuminate, which you unfortunately can't dodge because you have to get to Mirror Image. But Illuminate is a pretty good spell. It has a big radius, it can't damage you, and it even applies blind. Then I have Chain Lightning, which is another really solid spell. Both of these are also pretty cheap. Illuminate only costs 5 mana, Chain Lightning costs 20. And then I have Arcane Vortex, which is pretty bad, but you have to take it to get to Disruption Shield. And I think Disruption Shield is just core to Archmage. The third talent is Slipstream, and this is another sustain, which lets you move a single tile after you cast a beam instantly. And I thought that this would be pretty useful, but in the end I don't think it's actually worth the 40 mana that it costs to sustain it, because you don't need to do some like precise positioning since all of your beams are 3 wide, and if a melee enemy gets close to you, you don't want to move just a single tile, you want to move to the maximum range, because there are a bunch of melee talents in quotation marks that have a radius 1, 2 or 3 that can still hit you if you just move a little bit. So I just don't think this is very useful. The last talent is Elemental Array Burst, and it is your best beam. It will use your best damage increase and damage penetration, and if you compare the damage with my other beams, it just does almost twice as much. It then also has all these bonuses that interact with these trees that I did not take. For each of the elements, it can apply the bonuses you get. So it does try to push you towards these trees, but it's still really good just by itself. It does have a high cooldown of 12 turns, but it gets reduced each time you deal damage with a beam spell. If you've seen me talk about Archmage before, you know that I really like Stonewall. This is one of the best defensive talents. It allows you to completely reset a fight. You can see this goes up to 17 turns of you just being enclosed in a wall. So you can recharge all of your cooldowns, recharge your mana, whatever you need to do. You just press this button and get back to full power. But I didn't take this because I didn't want Mudslide, which is a big AoE spell, but it knocks back, which could be annoying. And I think ultimately Stonewall is something that you can play without, unlike Disruption Shield. It's not that Stonewall is worse, you could even argue it's a better talent, but the difference is Disruption Shield is good at preventing surprise ambush damage. This is how I see this talent. Its job is to keep you alive when you auto-explore, turn the corner, and there's 2 uniques and a rare waiting for you and they all manage to hit you before you get your turn. Disruption Shield keeps you alive, whereas Stonewall, potentially once you survive that damage, you can press Stonewall and completely recharge, but you already have other good reactive defensive talents like Mirror Image, or Time Prison, or just Face Door teleporting away, or Movement Infusion. So you have many ways to react to the damage, but not really many ways to prevent it during the first turn of combat. And that's really how you should look at Disruption Shield. I know there's a lot of text. All that matters is that instead of 500 life, I walk around with 300 life. The only thing that you need to be careful of is that it's possible that you will drop below 50% mana, but the shield will still look active. This is lying to you. If I would take damage right now, the shield would disappear and all the damage would go straight to my health. The shield would not tank any of it. You will also later unlock the meta category, and this is Disperse Magic, But then you get Spellcraft, which reduces the cooldown of all your spells, and it also basically guarantees you will spell shock any enemy you come across, which as you can see gives a 20% reduction of resistances. So it's just a big damage multiplier. So it's incredibly powerful. And it even has a special synergy with going Shalor, because Grace of the Eternals is a spell, and it has a really big cooldown. But with the 30% reduction and some investment, you can get it down to 18 turns of cooldown, which, together with Timeless, actually lets you use it twice in combat, potentially. Then the third talent is Energy Alteration, which helps deal with the problem of dealing multiple damage types by converting it to whichever damage type you want. You only want 4 points in this, not 5, because if you then get something like Life Drinker that has a proc on spell hit, the way this works in Tome is that you get a separate chance for each damage type. Alright, so if I hit the dummy with lightning, you see that I get 93% of all damage converted to lightning, and then if I use flame, I get 2 hits. Each of these has a 15% chance to fire the Blood Grasp. So keep this at 4 points. This is important. The Thunderstorm Sustain, you don't really care about the damage it's going to deal. I mostly just use it to spot any invisible enemies. Because if you auto-explore and you run into a rogue in stealth, the Thunderstorm will hit the rogue and it will stop you from auto-exploring and running into him. So I think that's worth the 50 mana. Another talent I want to mention is Invisibility. This talent is actually a lot better than I gave it credit for, because it turns out that the majority of enemies, if you inspect them, will have 0 in C invisibility. Now I don't know the exact calculations that go into whether or not enemies see you when you are invisible, but if you have a turn of downtime, this is a useful talent because it might waste a turn or 2 of the enemy. I've uploaded my whole playthrough of High Peak and the final boss without any commentary if you just want to see how the class plays or how I annihilated the final boss in like 5 turns. If you are doing the insane difficulty Archmage starting dungeon class evolution unlock, you can put 2 points into Pulverizing Ogre, because this starts off as a beam, whereas these two need points to become a beam, and once you kill the boss and unlock the class evolution, you take these 2 points out and spread them out, something like this. By level 10, I really like getting Temporal Shield to 3 points. It feels like sort of a sweet spot where it's big enough to make me feel safe. You get your beams online, Flame becomes a beam at effective talent level 5, which you only need 4 points for, and you get ready to go into Mirror Image. On the generics, you just make sure that you get Phase Door to 4 points as fast as possible, so that you can actually target it. First category point should go into an Inscription, so that you actually get 3 of them, since you have to run a Mana Search rune to help you in prolonged fights. And at this point, you should also have enough gold to go to Last Hope and get the generic weapons and armor usage, which will give you combat training for the always important thick skin. By level 20, I've cheated my stats so that I can put points into these 2 talents. In the actual game, you will need to find gear that increases your strength or constitution, put it on, put these points here, then take the gear off. On the class side, you have 4 points in Mirror Image at this point and use it at the beginning of pretty much every combat to make it tank for you. I also like going for Essence of Speed before Disruption Shield. The global speed just feels really good. And the only downside is that it costs 120 mana. And on the generic side you get Premonition, which is also really good, but also costs 120 mana. The absolute minimum amount of maximum mana you should have is, I think, 200. With 200 max mana, you can cast a couple of spell rotations, you can cast Temporal Shield, couple of beams, but then you have something like Time Prison, which can be a really good spell situationally, but it costs 100 mana, so it might be hard to pull off. So I think the comfortable minimum is 300 mana. At that point you can usually cast most of the spells that you want to cast. If you are wondering why I maxed Magic of the Eternals, which gives you crit chance and crit strike, which is fairly useless in the early game since you won't be critting very often, it's simply because there's just not many other talents to put the points into. This is too expensive. Displacement shield without shielding, not really that good. You might as well just put it here. The second category point, I think you should also just put into an inscription, because usually with the second one you would unlock a class tree, but you are going to get a class tree at level 25, so you don't need to unlock anything. By level 30 you have your orb at 3 points for the 5-turn duration, and the rest of these are really more for the late game, since they're all quite expensive mana-wise. And it might not seem like it's enough, but you can get through the majority of the game just with Flame, Lightning and Chain Lightning together with the Orb of Thaumaturgy. It's just a lot of damage. You also have Disruption Shield working for you at this point, which means you should now also invest into shielding, eventually getting it to 4 points for that 1-turn increased duration on shields. I just like having that. And you obviously also get Timeless, which is a massive help. By level 40, you unlock meta and start going into these talents. These are both another 160 mana in sustains, so it's very costly, and it will push your maximum mana back down to that 200, 300, hopefully at least max mana. And then you finally start going for the Elemental Array Burst, your ultimate weapon, and by level 50, the whole Thaumaturgy tree finally comes online, and then you just sprinkle a couple extra points wherever you need them. For example, Featherwind gets you all the bonuses just for 4 points, but I needed the extra 9% of stat immunity because of my items. The last category point I decided to put into an Escort tree, and you have the option to take curses from the Defiler Escort, and you take it purely for the Curse of Vulnerability. This is especially synergistic on this build because since we don't go into any of these trees that give you free resistance penetration, it can be a bit tough to get enough respen to kill late game enemies. And what's great about it is that if you use it before the beams, it will actually apply the spell shock from Spellcraft. So it's just the perfect opener. The only annoying part is that using it on orcs doesn't really work very well, since they have the talent that removes a bunch of debuffs from them. So it's not that good on orcs, but anything else gets absolutely destroyed by Curse of Vulnerability. And the other option, if you don't find a Defiler Escort, would be to unlock Sun Paladin Chants. This will give you more debuff removal, which is always welcome. And if you don't find that Escort either, which is theoretically possible, you could just take one of these trees that you like, but the problem is that you are just pretty tight on class points, so I didn't really see where I would get enough class points to invest into another class tree. For the second Prodigy, I think by far the best option is Arcane Amplification Drone. High Thaumaturgist plays basically like a ranged Arcane Blade, but instead of relying on RNG, it's consistent, so you just put down the orb, put down the drone, shoot the Elemental Array Burst, and pretty much one-shot basically any enemy. And that's not using the Curse of Vulnerability. I used to be really uncomfortable not taking any defensive prodigies. I would always do one defensive prodigy and one offensive one. On this type of character, I would take something like Ethereal Form. But the truth is that you just don't need it, especially on these like ranged type characters with super powerful defensive talents like Mirror Image. You basically never should be the target of any enemy. If they kill the Mirror Image and they are still alive, you can cast Time Prison on them to stall them until Mirror Image comes back, or you just run away. So you don't need defense, you don't need armor. You do definitely need resistances, because you will of course get hit sometimes, but offense is the best defense. The inscriptions are always a little different on Archmage, because you have shielding, so it's worth it to run a shield rune. Then this is my usual setup: Movement, Shatter, Dissipation. but I actually ended up running a mana search rune all the way until the end game, and I was really debating whether I should swap this for another Shatter Afflictions, and I think I should have once I got to like 600 mana. On gear, you look for increased lightning damage, lightning penetration. In theory, since you eventually get energy alteration, you could even go for increased flame, fire damage and fire pen, or arcane damage and arcane pen, but lightning damage makes the most sense. Then you pick up some crit multi, some crit chance, and try to get your spell power to 100. And then on the defensive side, you need to make sure your physical resist is always super high. This is by far the likeliest way that you are going to die, because you have premonition to take care of any other resistance, and then the usual here, stun immunity is a must-have, and confusion as silence is nice, but not really necessary. If you get silenced, you will still always have access to a movement infusion, or eventually a relentless pursuit in the late game, and ideally all these silences and sustained strips should be going on your mirror image. Whether or not you should be using a one-handed staff heavily depends on if you can find Life Drinker or not, because this is, I think, by a decent margin the best caster of hand. Basically, this item needs to be better than a greater staff modifier. If it's not, then you should just stick to a two-handed staff. So other than the stats I described, you also really want some maximum mana. Now, thankfully, this is pretty frequently just sort of added to the already good mage item modifiers. The other way to get maximum mana is to stack willpower, and then the last stat that you should keep an eye on is spell power on crit, because this can stack up to 4 times, so this is not actually +4, but it's +12. This doesn't make this amulet good, this is just a random tier 4 amulet, same with these gloves, pretty awful. Undeterred mod on the boots, psionic shield, because that's what I like using, and I finally got a usable Wheel of Fate. This one is pretty much purely offensively rolled. For the Alchemists, you want class points first, then generic points, then 4% spell critical strike chance, and then +3 magic and +3 willpower. From the Escorts, you're looking at +5 magic or +5 willpower, that's always useful. The corruption category from the Defiler, if you can find it, and from the Sun Paladins, you can pick up Chant of Fortress, which gives you some physical damage resistance. That's literally it, that's why you take it, and I think that makes it better than the other chant that just increases your maximum life. If you've tried Arcane Blade and you can't get it to work, you keep dying in the early game, but the concept of it sounds really fun, I recommend you try High Thaumaturgist, because it really is very similar, but you just shoot from range. And one-shotting uniques in the late game never stops being fun. Thanks for watching.